In the early years of the Cold War, as nuclear weapons and long-range delivery systems reshaped strategic reality, military planners confronted a problem that was both technical and philosophical, which was that early warning systems could never provide perfect information, yet political and military decisions might have to be made in minutes based on what those systems reported, forcing states to design architectures that functioned under uncertainty rather than eliminating it. The first generation of warning networks relied on radar arrays, signal detection stations, and reporting chains that stretched across vast geographic distances. But even at their most advanced, these systems were limited by physics, geography, weather, mechanical reliability, and human interpretation, ensuring that the data they produced would always be partial, delayed, or ambiguous. Early warning was therefore conceived not as a source of certainty, but as a probabilistic indicator that had to be integrated with intelligence assessments, command procedures, and pre-existing doctrine in order to shape response. The fundamental design challenge was to ensure that incomplete data did not produce catastrophic misjudgment, either by triggering premature escalation or by paralyzing decision-makers into inaction during genuine attack. This challenge shaped both the physical infrastructure of warning systems and the organizational culture that interpreted their outputs, embedding caution, redundancy, and cross-checking into every stage of the process. Radar networks were built with overlapping coverage to compensate for blind spots and technical failure. Yet planners understood that even overlapping sensors could misread atmospheric phenomena, debris, or routine activity as potential threat indicators, making raw detection insufficient without contextual analysis. Signal interpretation centers were therefore structured to filter, compare, and corroborate incoming reports before passing assessments upward, creating layers of review designed to absorb noise and prevent isolated anomalies from being treated as definitive evidence. At the same time, the speed of ballistic missile trajectories imposed strict time constraints, meaning that excessive delay in verification could undermine deterrence by reducing response options. And this tension between verification and timeliness defined the architecture of early warning throughout the Cold War. Political leaders demanded assurance that warning systems would not generate false alarms that forced them into irreversible decisions, yet they also required confidence that genuine attack would not go undetected until too late to respond, a dual requirement that no purely technical solution could satisfy. As a result, early warning systems were designed explicitly to operate with incomplete data, incorporating probabilistic thresholds, graded alert levels, and predefined response pathways that allowed for incremental escalation rather than binary choices. These pathways reflected recognition that uncertainty was unavoidable and that decision-makers needed structured options rather than absolute clarity. Intelligence analysis played a central role in contextualizing warning data, as analysts assessed broader political conditions, adversary posture, and historical patterns to determine whether anomalous signals aligned with credible threat scenarios, integrating technical detection with strategic judgment. The integration of early warning into command and control networks reinforced the need for disciplined interpretation, as raw sensor data was rarely transmitted directly to political leadership without intermediate analysis, ensuring that incomplete data was filtered through institutional processes before influencing policy. Training and exercises conditioned operators to expect ambiguity, emphasizing the importance of maintaining composure under uncertain conditions and of resisting the impulse to treat initial detection as confirmation. These cultural norms were as important as hardware in shaping how systems functioned, reinforcing the idea that early warning was a tool for informing judgment rather than dictating action. Technological evolution during the 1950s and 1960s expanded detection range and speed, yet also introduced new forms of uncertainty, as increasingly sensitive sensors detected more phenomena, not all of which could be easily categorized, amplifying the volume of incomplete data that had to be processed. The proliferation of space-based sensors later in the Cold War added additional layers of complexity, as infrared detection and orbital monitoring improved coverage, but remained subject to interference, signal degradation, and interpretive ambiguity, reinforcing rather than eliminating the need for human judgment. Throughout this evolution, the core principle remained consistent, that early warning systems could not promise certainty, and that their stability depended on managing incomplete information through redundancy, cross-verification, and disciplined escalation protocols. The design of these systems thus reflected a strategic philosophy grounded in risk management rather than technological optimism, acknowledging that in the nuclear age, the most dangerous errors were likely to arise not from ignorance alone, but from misplaced confidence in partial knowledge. By the late 1960s, early warning networks had become deeply embedded in national security architecture, operating continuously under the assumption that most signals would be false, ambiguous, or inconclusive, yet that the system had to remain ready to distinguish the rare, genuine threat from the constant background noise. This foundational period established the logic that would govern early warning for decades, namely, that stability required systems capable of functioning under uncertainty, absorbing incomplete data without collapsing into panic or complacency, and preserving decision space for leaders faced with the most consequential choices imaginable. As the Cold War advanced into the 1960s, early warning systems grew more sophisticated, yet the core design assumption remained unchanged, which was that no matter how advanced detection technologies became, the data they produced would remain incomplete, fragmented, and vulnerable to misinterpretation, forcing architects of warning networks to embed uncertainty directly into system logic, rather than treat it as a temporary flaw to be engineered away. Long-range radar chains were expanded and linked into integrated networks that transmitted information to centralized analysis centers, but these radars were still constrained by curvature of the Earth, atmospheric distortion, electronic interference, and maintenance limitations, meaning that detection could indicate the presence of an object without immediately clarifying its origin, trajectory, or intent. This ambiguity was particularly acute in the early phases of detection, when radar returns appeared as raw signals that had to be classified through successive filtering processes, each of which introduced both interpretation and delay. To mitigate this, warning systems were designed around corroboration, requiring multiple independent sensors to confirm an event before elevating alert levels, thereby reducing the likelihood that a single malfunction or anomaly would generate escalation pressure. This multi-sensor philosophy became foundational as planners concluded that incomplete data could only be made usable through comparison rather than through isolated measurement. Command centers responsible for processing warning information were structured to separate detection from assessment, ensuring that technical operators identified anomalies while dedicated analysts evaluated their strategic significance, reinforcing a division between signal recognition and decision recommendation. This institutional separation served as a buffer against overreaction, as analysts could contextualize technical data within broader intelligence assessments, including political developments, military posture, and historical precedent. The integration of early warning with intelligence agencies further strengthened this layered approach, as reports from signals intelligence, reconnaissance, and diplomatic channels were weighed alongside radar data to determine whether anomalies aligned with credible threat scenarios or represented benign activity. Time compression, however, remained a defining constraint, particularly as intercontinental ballistic missile capabilities matured, reducing potential warning intervals to minutes and intensifying the pressure on systems designed to operate cautiously. To address this, graded alert procedures were formalized, allowing for incremental increases in readiness based on confidence levels, rather than immediate transition to full retaliatory posture, thereby preserving decision space even under incomplete information. Exercises simulating warning scenarios reinforced these procedures, conditioning operators and decision-makers to expect ambiguity and to rely on structured thresholds rather than instinct, embedding restraint within operational culture. Technological improvements, including advances in computing and data transmission, increased the speed at which warning data could be processed, yet they also amplified the volume of information requiring interpretation, making filtration and prioritization essential components of system design. False positives remained an inherent risk, as environmental phenomena, satellite launches, or technical glitches could produce signals resembling attack indicators, underscoring the necessity of maintaining skepticism within analysis chains. The introduction of space-based detection systems in the late 1960s expanded coverage beyond the limitations of ground radar, yet these systems also operated under constraints of sensor, resolution, calibration drift, and environmental interference, reinforcing the reality that no detection method could provide complete certainty. Rather than eliminate incomplete data, these technologies multiplied its forms, requiring integration across domains to construct a coherent picture. Planners therefore invested heavily in redundancy not merely as a safeguard against physical destruction, but as a means of validating incomplete information through cross-domain confirmation. The organizational culture surrounding early warning evolved accordingly, emphasizing discipline, patience, and adherence to protocol under pressure, as premature interpretation was recognized as a greater danger than delayed confirmation. Political leaders were increasingly briefed on the probabilistic nature of warning data, shaping expectations that initial reports would be tentative and subject to revision, a practice designed to prevent overconfidence in preliminary detection. This expectation, management was critical as it aligned political decision-making tempo with the realities of incomplete data, reducing the likelihood that leaders would demand definitive answers where none could be provided. By the late 1960s, early warning systems had become complex, multi-layered structures explicitly engineered to function without complete information, absorbing ambiguity through procedural safeguards and institutional norms rather than technological perfection. The evolution of these systems demonstrated that the true objective of early warning was not immediate certainty, but controlled uncertainty, ensuring that incomplete data informed rather than dictated strategic choice. This period laid the groundwork for further refinement in subsequent decades, as the interplay between technological capability and interpretive discipline continued to define how states manage the ever-present possibility of catastrophic misjudgment under conditions of incomplete knowledge. As the late 1960s transitioned into the 1970s, early warning systems entered a phase in which technological expansion increased both their reach and their ambiguity, reinforcing the foundational premise that they had to function effectively with incomplete data rather than depend on definitive detection. The introduction of space-based infrared sensors capable of identifying missile launches from orbital vantage points dramatically extended detection range and reduced reliance on ground-based radar horizons. Yet these sensors introduced new interpretive challenges, as they detected heat signatures that could be distorted by atmospheric conditions, reflections, or unrelated phenomena, requiring careful discrimination before being treated as credible indicators. This dual-source environment, combining ground radar and space-based observation, improved redundancy, but also multiplied the forms of incomplete information that analysts had to reconcile. Warning architecture was therefore restructured to emphasize fusion centers where data from diverse sensors could be compared, filtered, and cross-validated in near real time, institutionalizing the principle that no single detection channel should be considered authoritative in isolation. Computing capacity expanded during this period, enabling more rapid processing of incoming data streams, but faster processing did not eliminate uncertainty, as automated systems could misclassify signals without contextual oversight, reinforcing the need for human judgment embedded within the analytic chain. Early warning was thus increasingly conceptualized as a probabilistic assessment rather than a binary trigger, with operators trained to assign confidence levels and escalate alerts in graduated stages rather than declare definitive conclusions. This graded approach allowed command systems to increase readiness incrementally while preserving space for verification, reducing the risk that incomplete data would force premature strategic decisions. False alarms, which occurred periodically due to sensor error, environmental interference, or data transmission faults, reinforced the institutional commitment to layered confirmation, as after-action reviews emphasize the importance of skepticism and procedural rigor. These incidents did not undermine the value of early warning, but they underscored its inherent fragility, shaping organizational culture around the expectation that incomplete data was the norm rather than the exception. Political leadership increasingly relied on structured briefings that explained both the content and the uncertainty of warning reports, aligning strategic decision-making with the probabilistic nature of detection and reducing pressure for instantaneous reaction. Exercises during this period frequently simulated degraded data conditions, including partial sensor failure or conflicting signals, conditioning operators and commanders to operate under ambiguity without escalating unnecessarily. This training embedded a philosophy of restraint into the architecture of early warning, ensuring that incomplete information was met with verification rather than panic. Technological integration across domains further deepened system complexity as early warning outputs were linked to command and control networks and decision support tools designed to present synthesized assessments rather than raw data, reinforcing the buffer between detection and action. Redundancy remained central, not only in hardware, but in analytic review, as multiple teams independently evaluated critical indicators before alerts were elevated to senior leadership, reducing the probability that a single interpretive error would propagate upward. The design of communication channels also reflected the assumption of incomplete data, as fallback pathways and confirmation loops were built into reporting chains to preserve clarity, even if primary links were degraded. Intelligence agencies continued to provide contextual analysis that framed warning data within broader geopolitical trends, ensuring that anomalous signals were weighed against political reality rather than interpreted in isolation. The cumulative effect of these developments was the normalization of uncertainty within early warning doctrine, transforming incomplete data from a vulnerability into a managed condition. By the mid-1970s, early warning systems were understood as dynamic processes rather than static detectors, operating continuously under conditions of partial information and relying on layered safeguards to prevent catastrophic misjudgment. This maturation marked a significant shift from early Cold War reliance on technological optimism toward a disciplined acceptance that ambiguity was intrinsic to detection and that stability depended on designing systems capable of absorbing incomplete signals without collapsing into overreaction or complacency. As strategic competition persisted, the resilience of early warning increasingly depended not on eliminating uncertainty, but on institutionalizing methods for interpreting it cautiously, a principle that would remain central as the Cold War entered its final decade. As the mid-1970s progressed into the early 1980s, early warning systems confronted a strategic environment characterized by higher operational tempo, denser sensor networks, and growing awareness of how easily incomplete data could generate destabilizing pressure, prompting a further refinement of design philosophy toward resilience under ambiguity rather than speed alone. Ballistic missile flight times remained measured in minutes, yet the expansion of surveillance technologies produced increasingly complex data streams that required interpretation before action, reinforcing the understanding that raw detection without contextual analysis posed greater risk than delayed but validated assessment. Space-based infrared systems were integrated more tightly with ground-based radar, creating layered detection chains in which initial indications were cross-checked through multiple domains before escalating alert status, embedding corroboration as a structural requirement rather than a discretionary step. This architecture recognized that incomplete data would often arrive asymmetrically, with one sensor indicating anomalous activity while others remained silent, and that such asymmetry demanded caution rather than immediate response. Computing systems were upgraded to handle larger volumes of information, yet designers remained wary of automation overriding human judgment, ensuring that operators retained authority to question, reinterpret, or delay algorithmic conclusions when uncertainty persisted. Training programs emphasized operating under degraded conditions, including partial sensor failure, contradictory inputs, or communication disruption, conditioning personnel to expect inconsistency and to adhere to protocol rather than improvising under pressure. Graded alert systems were further formalized, allowing incremental readiness adjustments that signaled awareness without committing to irreversible escalation, thereby preserving political decision space even when warning confidence was incomplete. The psychological dimension of early warning became more prominent during this period, as internal reviews acknowledged that stress, fatigue, and expectation bias could influence interpretation, leading to procedural safeguards designed to distribute responsibility across teams and prevent single individuals from bearing decisive authority under ambiguous conditions. Intelligence agencies continued to provide contextual framing, integrating warning data with assessments of adversary posture, diplomatic signaling, and broader strategic trends, reinforcing the principle that early warning could not be understood in isolation from geopolitical reality. The accumulation of historical data enabled pattern recognition, allowing analysts to compare current signals with past anomalies and to calibrate confidence accordingly, yet planners recognized that over-reliance on precedent could obscure genuine change, reinforcing the need for analytic flexibility. Redundancy remained central to design, with parallel communication pathways, backup power systems, and geographically dispersed command centers, ensuring continuity even if primary nodes were compromised, reflecting the belief that incomplete data would be most dangerous when combined with infrastructural fragility. Political leaders were increasingly briefed on the probabilistic nature of warning assessments, aligning expectations with system realities and reducing the likelihood that incomplete reports would trigger disproportionate reaction. Exercises simulating ambiguous detection scenarios became more frequent, reinforcing cultural norms of skepticism and patience within command chains. The cumulative effect of these adaptations was a warning architecture that treated incomplete data as an expected operating condition rather than an exception, embedding caution and cross-verification into its core logic. By the early 1980s, early warning systems had evolved into complex, layered networks designed to function continuously despite uncertainty, absorbing noise and anomaly without collapsing into panic. This evolution reflected a strategic philosophy that prioritized stability through disciplined interpretation, recognizing that in a nuclear environment, the greatest danger lay not in imperfect detection alone, but in the mismanagement of imperfection. As Cold War tensions fluctuated, the resilience of early warning systems depended less on sensor range or speed than on institutional capacity to manage ambiguity, reinforcing the central lesson that incomplete data, if properly contextualized and processed, could inform rational decision-making rather than precipitate catastrophe. As the early to mid-1980s unfolded, early warning systems operated within a strategic climate marked by heightened tension, technological saturation, and compressed decision cycles, making their ability to function under incomplete data not merely a technical requirement, but a central pillar of strategic stability. Advances in detection technologies increase sensitivity and coverage, yet they simultaneously multiplied the number of signals requiring interpretation, reinforcing the enduring reality that more data did not equate to greater certainty. Command centers were therefore structured around layered review processes in which detection teams, analytic cells, and senior evaluators independently assessed incoming information before elevating alerts, institutionalizing skepticism as a safeguard against premature escalation. The architecture of warning emphasized temporal buffering, embedding short but deliberate delays into escalation pathways to allow corroboration from independent sources, reflecting a belief that disciplined pause under ambiguity was safer than instantaneous reaction. Integration between early warning and intelligence agencies deepened as strategic context. Political developments, adversary posture, routine launch schedules was systematically cross-referenced with sensor outputs to prevent isolated anomalies from being interpreted as hostile intent. Communication resilience remained a core priority, as designers recognized that incomplete data would be most destabilizing if paired with degraded reporting channels, prompting investment in redundant transmission pathways and geographically dispersed analysis centers. The psychological dimension of warning operations received continued attention, with procedures designed to reduce cognitive bias, distribute responsibility, and prevent confirmation pressure from influencing interpretation, particularly during periods of heightened geopolitical strain. Historical baselines played a critical role as long-term pattern analysis enabled analysts to distinguish routine variation from genuine anomaly, yet planners remained alert to the risk that overfamiliarity could dull sensitivity to change, reinforcing the need for periodic reassessment of assumptions. Graded alert systems were refined to signal awareness without committing to irreversible steps, preserving flexibility for political leaders faced with incomplete assessments. Exercises during this period increasingly simulated conflicting data streams, communication outages, and ambiguous threat indicators, reinforcing training in disciplined adherence to protocol under stress. The cumulative effect of these measures was a warning architecture designed explicitly to withstand uncertainty, ensuring that incomplete information did not automatically translate into decisive action. Political leadership adapted to this reality by accepting that warning briefings would present probability ranges rather than definitive conclusions, aligning strategic expectations with operational constraints. The resilience of early warning systems thus rested not on eliminating ambiguity, but on embedding caution into their interpretive core. recognizing that catastrophic error was more likely to arise from overconfidence in partial data than from measured skepticism. By the mid-1980s, early warning had matured into a continuous process of risk management rather than a binary trigger mechanism, reflecting decades of institutional learning about the limits of detection and the dangers of misinterpretation. This evolution underscored that the true strength of early warning lay in its ability to manage incomplete data through structured interpretation, disciplined communication, and incremental escalation protocols. As strategic competition continued, these systems functioned as stabilizing intermediaries, absorbing ambiguity and preserving decision space even when confronted with complex and uncertain signals, reinforcing the principle that stability in the nuclear age depended less on technological perfection than on institutionalized restraint in the face of incomplete knowledge. As the late 1980s approached, early warning systems increasingly operated in a strategic environment defined not only by technological density, but by political transition, requiring their designers and operators to reconcile systems built for confrontation with an atmosphere of cautious de-escalation. And this transition reinforced the necessity of maintaining disciplined interpretation of incomplete data, even as geopolitical tensions shifted. Warning architectures remained active and vigilant, but their outputs were increasingly evaluated alongside diplomatic developments and changing military posture, ensuring that anomalous signals were interpreted within broader context rather than through assumptions of permanent hostility. Intelligence agencies continued to provide comparative assessments, measuring warning data against both historical baselines and current political realities, preventing outdated threat models from dominating interpretation during a period of rapid change. The persistence of ambiguity remained central, as technical sensors could still produce incomplete or conflicting signals regardless of political climate, reinforcing the principle that institutional caution had to endure even when strategic rhetoric softened. Communication networks were maintained and tested rigorously to ensure that political leadership retained situational awareness as long as possible, minimizing the circumstances under which incomplete data might reach decision-makers without contextual filtering. Graded alert procedures remained intact, preserving incremental response options that allowed leaders to signal concern without committing to irreversible escalation. Training continued to emphasize operating under degraded and ambiguous conditions, embedding a culture of patience and verification within command centers, despite the reduced intensity of confrontation. The accumulation of decades of data allowed analysts to compare current anomalies against long-term trends with greater confidence. Yet planners remained attentive to the possibility that genuine change could manifest in unfamiliar ways, requiring flexibility as well as skepticism. Early warning thus functioned as both a technical system and a strategic barometer, reflecting not only sensor outputs, but the evolving interpretive frameworks applied to them. The durability of these systems during a period of transition underscored that their design for incomplete data was not contingent on rivalry alone, but on the inherent limitations of detection technologies and human cognition. By the end of the Cold War, early warning networks had become institutionalized components of national security, operating continuously with the expectation that ambiguity was permanent, and that disciplined interpretation was the only reliable safeguard against catastrophic error. The resilience of these systems lay in their layered architecture, distributed analysis, and conservative escalation pathways, all of which were designed to absorb incomplete information rather than eliminate it. The experience of the Cold War demonstrated that early warning stability depended less on sensor accuracy alone than on the integration of technical detection with contextual intelligence and procedural restraint. As confrontation receded, These systems continued to operate under the same foundational assumption that perfect information was unattainable, reinforcing the broader lesson that in domains where time is short and consequences existential, structured uncertainty management is more valuable than illusory certainty. The evolution of early warning systems thus revealed a strategic philosophy grounded in humility toward data, acknowledging that incomplete information would always shape decision-making, and that stability required designing institutions capable of managing that incompleteness without surrendering either vigilance or restraint. In the final assessment of how Cold War early warning systems were designed to operate with incomplete data, it becomes clear that their most defining feature was not technological sophistication alone, but the deliberate institutional acceptance of uncertainty as an enduring operating condition, shaping every layer of detection, analysis, and decision-making across decades of strategic rivalry. From the earliest radar chains to the integration of space-based sensors and computerized fusion centers, warning architectures were constructed around the understanding that no sensor would ever deliver total clarity, that no signal would arrive free of ambiguity, and that the greatest danger lay not in imperfect detection, but in the mismanagement of imperfection. This philosophy produced layered systems in which redundancy, cross-verification, graded alerts, and procedural buffers absorbed ambiguity before it reached. Political leadership, ensuring that incomplete data informed deliberation rather than dictating action. The integration of technical detection with contextual intelligence prevented isolated anomalies from escalating unchecked, embedding warning outputs within broader assessments of adversary posture, political climate, and historical precedent. Organizational culture reinforced this restraint, training operators to expect conflicting signals, to assign confidence levels rather than definitive judgments, and to treat skepticism as professional responsibility rather than hesitation. Technological advances increased coverage and speed, yet they also expanded the volume of ambiguous information requiring interpretation, confirming that complexity amplified rather than eliminated incompleteness. Resilience was therefore achieved not by eliminating uncertainty, but by distributing responsibility across systems and personnel, ensuring that no single malfunction, misreading, or assumption could trigger irreversible decisions. Graded escalation pathways preserved decision space under time pressure, allowing political leaders to respond incrementally while additional verification accumulated. The durability of early warning systems through periods of intense rivalry and later political transition demonstrated that their stability derived from disciplined process rather than momentary clarity, anchoring strategic judgment in layered safeguards. Throughout the Cold War, these systems functioned continuously with the expectation that most signals would be inconclusive and that rare, genuine threats would emerge from a background of noise, reinforcing the importance of institutional patience. By the end of the confrontation, early warning networks stood as examples of governance under existential constraint, engineered to manage ambiguity rather than conquer it, and to preserve rational decision-making in an environment defined by incomplete knowledge. The central lesson of their evolution is that in the nuclear age, stability depended less on achieving certainty than on designing systems that remained stable without it, demonstrating that controlled uncertainty, when structured through disciplined architecture and culture, could be a foundation for deterrence rather than a source of collapse.